What is up everyone, Nick here, and in today's video we're going to be building our very own identity disk from Tron Legacies. So without further ado, let's get right into it. In this video, we're mostly going to be discussing the 3D printed components that I used to build this disk, and then we're going to talk about some of the hardware, the coding, and some of the wiring that went into this. I'd also like to thank PCBWAY for sending me these 3D printed parts. No post-processing was done on my end. All I needed to do was assemble the disk. PCBWAY, if you don't know it already, is the industry leader when it comes to PCB manufacturing and 3D printing solutions. From custom circuit boards to innovative 3D printed prototypes, PCBWAY offers unparalleled quality, fast turnaround times, and competitive pricing. If you would like $10 off your very first order, I'll have a referral link in the description. I should also mention that this disc was designed by Shrieker1. They have a listing up on Cults 3D for the 3D models, and with your purchase, you get a bunch of other stuff required to build this. With your purchase, not only do you get the files to print this, but you also get a bill of materials, a wiring diagram, sound effects, and the config file for the coding. So without further ado, let's check out those parts. And here we have pretty much everything we're going to need to build the identity disk. For starters, we have the 3 different kinds of NeoPixels. Then we have our Proffieboard, more on that later. Then we have a bunch of switches that we're going to be using to turn it on and off. We have our batteries. We also have our mini speaker. This is actually quite neat. This speaker is used for RC trains. It's absolutely tiny, but from the videos I've seen of the identity disk working, it seems to be pretty powerful, so I'm really excited to see how this works. We also have our battery contacts for the batteries, and then we have 2 different kinds of LEDs. I'm not entirely sure how these are actually going to work because I'm pretty sure we have to strip all the LED diodes from inside the plastic, and we're going to be using the plastic to diffuse light, but we'll get there when we get there. So if you're curious on where I got the parts list for all this, it's included in the purchase of the identity disk files. So if you purchase the files, you'll have access to the parts list, and from there you can choose to source it from wherever you want. I think most of the links are from eBay, but I decided to go with AliExpress to save on money because I'm an absolute cheapskate. But of course we have one thing missing here, and that would be the resin prints. And here we have the 3 main components that are going to make up our disk. These were printed by PCBWAY in their Somos Taurus resin, and this stuff is absolutely phenomenal. The quality of these prints is just off the charts. Number 1, the layer lines are barely visible. It's extremely smooth to the touch. And on top of that, the level of precision in the actual parts themselves is bananas, because without any need for post-processing, I was actually able to assemble this. The parts come together super easy. So we have the middle section, which is what contains most of the electronics, like the batteries and whatnot. We have this underside, and then we have this top panel, which interlocks into the top half of this. So if I just align it correctly, it just falls in. And if I twist it together, it locks into place into one solid piece. And one thing I forgot to mention, the resin used for this is absolutely solid. Like, it's not gonna break anytime soon. And of course, we are missing a few pieces here. Namely, we're missing the clear parts. So this is the main ring piece that goes around here. This is like the extended blade, if you will. And of course, we have these little inner detail bits which just go right in there like so. And then we have like a bunch of smaller pieces like these clear bits that are gonna go right here. And we also have the diodes in the middle of the ring. But before we get into the actual assembly of this thing or any of the wiring, we're going to talk about coding. So I'm gonna move all this aside, and I'm going to show you guys what this Proffieboard can really do. So when it comes to configuring your Proffieboard for this project, I would definitely recommend going with the Proffieboard version 2.2. I initially got the version 3.9 for this, but for some reason I could not get that board to work for the life of me. I don't know if it's because the SD card holder was faulty or whatnot, but whatever I would do, I would try changing things, do things in a different order. I could not get that board to work at all. But I picked up a version 2.2, did the exact same steps, and it works flawlessly. So if you're gonna make this project, I definitely recommend picking up a 2.2 just to be on the side of caution. Because they essentially work the same, it's just that the other one is slightly better, but honestly, it's not really gonna make a difference, and you're more likely to get a project that's actually gonna work. But once you get your board, we do have to configure a few things on Arduino IDE. This is very similar to what we did for the Wemos board, what we did for the ATtiny85 board. Basically, we need to add this board onto Arduino IDE so we can program it. because Arduino IDE does not come built in with a selection of Proffieboards. So once again, we're going to have to go into File, in Preferences, and select Additional Boards Manager URLs. And then we can just copy and paste the link that I'll leave in the description. It's also available on the Proffieboard website, but just for the sake of this tutorial, I'll have it on the screen and I'll have it in the description just so that it's easier to find. And once we click on OK, we can now go into Tools, select our board, and we'll find the Proffieboard 2.2 in the selection. And now we're gonna have to go on the Proffieboard website and download the ProffiOS folder. In this folder, we'll have a .ino file. This is the file that we're going to open up in Arduino. And once that's downloaded and we've opened up the file in Arduino IDE, we now have to add our config file. And this is very similar to when you're making an Iron Man helmet using Crashworks 3D code. You have a config file that is available where you can make modifications without actually modifying the code itself. This is basically a text document that Arduino opens up and configures your code using the information that you've added into that config file. Now Shrieker, the person who designed this disk, already created a config file expressively made for the disk, and it's available in their Google Drive, which you can have access to once you've bought the files. So once you've downloaded that config file, you can go into the ProffiOS folder and you'll see all these subfolders. One of them is called config. You're going to paste it into that folder. And once we've done that, we can go back into the code and tell the code what config file it needs. You'll see that there's a line called define config file, and between these quotes, we're going to add config/Tron identity disk 2.h. Make sure that for the Tron identity disk title, you have proper capitalization on Tron, identity, and disk. And once you've done that, the code will now know which config file it needs to access and upload to our Proffieboard. Now, one other thing I should mention when it comes to programming the Proffieboard, if you're like me and you buy your NeoPixel strips off of AliExpress to save on money, they might not work perfectly with this config file for the Tron blade. So if we go to the very bottom of the Tron config file by Shrieker, you'll notice that we have blade configs. So this is a configuration for each and every type of the NeoPixels that we're using on the disk. So you'll notice if we read these lines, we have the type of NeoPixel, the number of NeoPixels, which blade pin it's connected to, and the color. Now the color is what's most important here. So depending on the NeoPixels that you use, if you connect them to the board and suddenly you see greens, blues, and reds, and they're not at all the correct color configuration that they should be, we're going to have to fine tune the color configuration on the config file. Now you'll notice on mine, they all say GRB, but depending on your NeoPixel strips, it might have to be RGB instead. So red, blue, green. So that would be the order of the code for each color for red, green, and blue. But for my NeoPixels, the code transmitting to the NeoPixels needs to be in the order of green, then red, then blue. It might work fine for you. I just had an absolute headache trying to figure this out for myself. I spent like days on this trying to figure out what was wrong with the config file, what was wrong with the code. Maybe it was something wrong with my NeoPixels. Turns out it was as easy as switching a few letters in the config file, and that was it. Now the only thing we have left to do as far as coding goes is configure the SD card for the Proffieboard with all the sounds that we need. Now there's a very specific way you need to configure your SD card with like naming and folders and whatnot, or else the Proffieboard is just not going to be able to communicate with it. So let me show you guys how to do that. Now we're going to start off with something that's fairly easy. We're going to create a folder on the SD card that is just called common. The common file is going to be where we're going to put all the sound effects for the menu. So if we go on the Proffieboard website, we'll find a page called Free Prop Sounds, and at the very bottom we have a repository for all the different variations of the common folder. So we're just gonna pick the very first one that's English, and we're gonna download it and copy and paste all the sound effects from within the zip file into the common folder on our SD card. And next up, we need to create the tracks folder. So just create that on your SD card. And the tracks folder is basically going to contain all the music from the soundtrack of Tron Legacy. And Shrieker already created a folder in their Google Drive with all the correctly named tracks. So we can just download that, copy all the tracks from within the zip file, and paste it into the tracks folder, just like we did with the common folder. Now lastly, we need to create folders for each and every font of each character we're going to be adding to this identity disk. Basically, Shrieker already created a bunch of different fonts within the config file, So one of them is going to be for Clue, and it's going to make the blade of the identity disc orange, or another one for Tron that's going to be blue, and so on and so forth. So inside the SD card, we need to create a folder for Clue, Flynn, Games, Rectify, Rinsler, and Spin Master, each with capitalization. The only one being different is Clue. All 3 letters are capitalized. Once those folders are created, the sound effects we need to add into them, we need to buy. So I'll leave a link in the description to SaberFont. It's a website where people can buy fonts for their lightsabers and blades, and we're going to be buying Juan Sith's Tron profile. And once you've bought it, we're going to unzip it, and we're gonna go throughout the folder, and we're gonna open Tron Proffieboard, and you're going to see all these different sound effects. You have blast, you have boot, you have clash. We're going to copy each and every file inside of this folder into each and every one of those different fonts we just created. Now, before you get all excited and plug your SD card into your Proffieboard and expect the sounds to work, they're probably not gonna work the way you want them to. First off, we have to adjust the WAV files because they might not work on the speaker that we're using. I encountered this problem myself while I was working on the identity disc. What you want to do is take your WAV files into Audacity, and when you export them, you want to select mono channel as your audio option, and you want to make sure that you select the right encoding option and the sample rate. And once that's done, your audio files should work off of your speaker in the identity disc. Now, there is some more configuration we're going to have to do for the disc. Basically, the Tron font that we purchased from Juan Smith is only one type of font. If we want to make fonts for different characters to go with the different colors of the inner ring, we also want to delete and add the audio files that we want associated with each character font. One thing I recommend doing with each of the character fonts at the very least is deleting the font.wav file, because the font.wav file included with the Tron font just says Tron. And when you're cycling through 6 different fonts and it just keeps going Tron, Tron, it gets redundant. So we're gonna make our very own. Now, Shrieker already has included a file in the drive folder that has extra audio files. So we can pick from there, make sure that it's encoded properly in Audacity. And once we figure out which audio clip we want to use with which character, we can rename it font.wav and put it in the correct character file. So that'll replace the Tron audio with whatever audio that we end up picking. And then we can do this for the blast sounds too. Now, Juan Sith's Proffi pack already has some blast files, but they're only clips related to Sam, Flynn, and Rinsler. So for each character, we can adjust which sound files we want as long as they're named correctly. So for example, if I open up my font file and I go to Rinsler, you'll notice that I have all these blast files right here that are named BLST1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. However, I've since deleted most of Juan Sith's original blast files and replaced them with audio related to Rinsler. So in my Rinsler font, I only have Rinsler blast sounds. So that means that once the disc is activated, I can press the auxiliary button and trigger those sounds randomly. And once you've done that, the SD card is basically configured and ready to go. You can take it out, plug it into your Proffieboard, and you're ready to upload the code from Arduino IDE onto your Proffieboard. And one other thing I should mention, if you have any issues actually uploading the code onto the board, or maybe your computer doesn't even recognize the board when you plug it in, that's because you might have to update the driver that's on your board, or maybe your board just doesn't have a driver. For this, you can actually use a software called Zadig. So basically, you hold onto the boot button, you plug it in, and you click on the reset button, and that should set your board into bootloader mode, and then you'll be able to update the driver. Now, I'll leave a link in the description to a full-on tutorial on how to do this. If you have any questions or doubts, I can guarantee you that there's information out there that can help you. I did use quite a few online forums to help me figure out what I was doing exactly, one of which is called the Crucible, and I'll leave a link to the Crucible in the description down below. And now that we have our Proffieboard all configured, the sound effects are working and everything, we can finally start wiring up our disc. Now, this part of the video isn't necessarily going to be a tutorial. I'm going to just be going through the motions. If I have any issues, I'll be talking about them throughout this video as we go on. But for the most part, I'm just going to be following Shrieker's wiring diagram that they left inside of the Google Drive folder. Now, there's quite a few things we have to wire up to actually get this to work. We need to figure out how we're going to deal with the batteries, the speaker, the 2 buttons, and the 4 different NeoPixel configurations. Thankfully, there's no guesswork when it comes to what pin does what on the board. They're indicated in the wiring diagram. It's just going to be a question of how we guide our wires throughout the print so that we can still close it up and have it work correctly. So I think what I'm gonna do is start with the battery contacts. That way we can start testing out the board, making sure that everything works as we go along. So I have my battery contacts right here. I have the springy ones, which are gonna go on the negative side. I have the flat ones for the positive side. Now, if I understand correctly, since we're going to be using 5 of these 14500 batteries, we want to wire this in parallel. So that means that all the ground contacts are gonna come together into one wire, and all the positive contacts of the batteries are gonna come together into one wire. So we're going to keep our voltage at 3.4 volts, but we're going to drastically increase our power bank capacity. So one battery is 750 milliamp hour times 5. That means that with the 5 batteries inside our disk, we're going to have a capacity of 3,750 milliamp hours, which is not bad. So I'm gonna put these batteries aside and I'm gonna start wiring the positive and negative leads for these contacts, making sure to keep them in parallel. So I've just gone ahead and soldered all the leads for the batteries. So we have our positive and we have our negative going to the board. Now I am getting a little bit ahead of myself. I started doing some of the other leads. For example, if I just move this to the side, you will notice 2 wires sticking out, the black and blue one. That's for the switch on this side of the identity disk. So I soldered those leads in advance and then glued the button into place. That way I could connect it to the board later. And I definitely recommend making the leads way longer than you need to ahead of time, because a few times now I've had to unsolder stuff because wires were just not long enough. Which is exactly why for the wires for power for the NeoPixels, I cut them to this length. Now I know this is kind of bonkers, but I will be trimming them down as I go along. It's better to have too much and not need it than to have too little and need it, you know? So whenever I do the So whenever I do solder the NeoPixels later on, I can just trim these to size and not have to worry about not having enough wire. And I definitely recommend picking up some small screws for the kill switch on the identity disk, because once you start disassembling this to do maintenance or to add the NeoPixels, you might want to unscrew the button. That way you can take this whole assembly off and work on the rest of the disk. So I'm gonna finish soldering the power going to the board, and I'll solder up the button, and then I'm gonna test out whether the board works or not on the batteries using the serial monitor on Arduino IDE.
One eternity later.
Now, before you get to soldering, I highly recommend you go with the thinnest gauge wire you can possibly get your hands on. Now, from what I understand, most people will use slightly bigger gauge wire, anything from like 24 to 22 for wires carrying power. And for the rest, it can be smaller gauge like 26 or 28 gauge. Now, the reason I mention this is because while I was doing the wiring, I had to completely strip out all the wiring inside of it and start from scratch with much smaller gauge wire because it couldn't close properly. And as a result, my wiring got sloppier and sloppier. The contacts got all gummed up. It was just not a good time. So I highly recommend starting on the right foot and getting small gauge wire before you start this project, and also be mindful of the wiring connections and make sure that your wiring isn't getting in the way of the shell and causing issues. It honestly got so bad for me that I kind of gave up on some of the lighting on this. Instead of having the tiny diodes on each corner of the discs on both sides, I decided to just not bother with that. And one other reason you want to make sure that your wiring is super tidy and doesn't take up too much space is because I broke not 1, but 2 SD cards trying to close the shell because it was just too bulky and the SD card would get caught on something, and as I was twisting the shell back together, the SD card would snap. I made quite a few mistakes working on this project, which is exactly why I'm highlighting them in this video so you don't make those mistakes. But with that all out of the way, this thing is nuts. Like, really, this thing is nuts. I don't know where to begin with this thing, so I guess we're just gonna boot it on. So, of course, we have the kill switch right here. It just barely sticks out, so we can flip it just like that. We have audio that plays when it boots up. So as you can see, the light and the outer ring is glowing. The little notches on the inside are glowing too. They pulsate very slowly. And then if we hold this button, now by the way, the button configuration on this is slightly different than it is in the config file. In the config file, it has FET's button configuration. I decided to go with a different one, which is also available on the Proffieboard folder that we downloaded. Now, if I hold this button, it'll switch the font. So now we're on Clue. We'll create the perfect system. I will create the perfect system. I'm a nerd. I'm a big ol' nerd. Now if I hold it again, we have Rinsler, then we have a green one, then we have Spin Master. Now Spin Master is a lot of fun. Now as you might know, each of the fonts that we installed on the SD card, each font has their own dedicated track, and the one for Spin Master is derez. So if I just click this button instead of holding it down, okay, I'm gonna stop it there because I don't want to get flagged for copyright. Now the button on the other side of the disc is to activate the outer blade, kind of like when you press a lightsaber and the lightsaber blade opens up, same deal with this. Now, if I hold this again, it's gonna go to Flynn. He even says his name, it's wonderful. And if I click the other side of this, it turns on. This thing is loud. I hope you guys can even hear me over this. Since there's a motion control board on the Proffieboard, it responds to movement. Now, if I click on the auxiliary button again, we'll get those blast sounds that I talked about. Now that's one I installed myself from the extras in Shrieker's extras folder. So to turn it off with this specific button configuration, I have to hold on auxiliary and hold the other button, and it turns it off. And switch to Clue. Now Clue is kind of fun because I only added a single blast sound effect for this font, and you'll see really quickly why I did that. So let me turn it on. Okay, I'm sorry. Jeff Bridges is just a goofy guy, okay? Now the font I spent the most time adjusting and adding extra blast effects to is Rinsler. Is that foreshadowing to something? I don't know. So let's boot this baby up. And of course we have the motion control board on the inside. Oh my. I'm dizzy. As difficult as this was to build, I am so glad I did because this is just so freaking cool. So I kind of built this on a whim after seeing the files online and after some very slight convincing from my friends. And I'm so glad I did because I actually got to learn quite a bit about electronics and coding that I did not know before. And it kind of broadened my horizons in terms of what is actually available on the market in terms of hardware for cosplay related stuff. For example, these tiny microphones, these were just $3 on digikey.ca and they work so well. They are super loud. This is what I have in the identity disc right now. And honestly, I could see myself using these in helmets in the future to have sound effects opening up, closing, because most Crashworks boards nowadays have built-in sound effects. It's just a question of getting the right speaker. And I'm the type of person that likes to build things that are basically either modular or independent from other hardware. So to have a helmet that has a built-in speaker for sound effects, so instead of having a speaker for a helmet that is inside a costume and having to plug in wires and whatnot, I can just have this thing inside a helmet and not even have to really worry about space issues. So I'll leave a link in the description to the speaker I used for this project, so that way you can get the specs that you would need and use it in your own projects. I actually tested this on a Crashworks board just the other day and it worked flawlessly. But with that said, that's pretty much it for today's video, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please, if you like this video, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please leave them in the comments. I'll be more than happy to answer you. And stay tuned for more Tron content. Tron-tent, baby, because there's plenty more where this came from. And again, a special thank you to PCBWAY for sponsoring the channel and for sponsoring this project in particular. And I really hope to see you all in the next one. Whoop, bang. Done.